Chapter 5. Carrying her find, Doreen nudged Muggs and Goliath and Thaddeus back inside. She couldn't wait to get to her computer and search for Betty Miles. Doreen was all about the fun of figuring out this mystery. Inside, she carefully placed the fancy box on the kitchen table. It was both clean and dirty. She laughed. How can something be both, Doreen? But it was. The creek had kept it mostly clean. But over time, the creases of the carvings had filled with sediment that filled the river. She wasn't sure if that was dirt all through it or something else. She grabbed her cell phone and took several photos of the box. She was learning. Once Mac knew about this, he'd be over here in a heartbeat, and she'd never see the box again. Moving around it until she had photographs of all sides, she transferred all the images to her laptop. With that done, she got up and put on the electric tea kettle. Only to remember she'd left her teacup outside. She dashed outside to retrieve it as the water boiled. As she walked back inside, Muggs raced in at her heels, thinking the run was good fun. The kettle wasn't ready yet, though. While she waited, she looked online for the cold case that her neighbor had talked about. She frowned, thinking about her neighbor's voice. And the trouble was, that voice coming from behind the fence was androgynous. Doreen couldn't tell who she'd been talking to earlier today. It had been querulous and cranky, as if nothing was ever good enough for it. And she hated to use that term when it referred to a person, but she really didn't have a clue if the neighbor speaking to her today had been male or female. And that was a mystery in itself. She grinned. Another one. Perfect. When she ran her query through the search engine, all kinds of links came up. She read each one to find out that a Betty Miles had disappeared close to 30 years ago, like her neighbor had said. She'd been a troubled teen, running away from home several times. When she had disappeared the last time, everybody had thought she'd just run away again. But when she never came back, Betty's mother got worried. She filed a missing persons report, but apparently nobody had ever heard from or had ever seen Betty Miles again. There was no evidence to indicate foul play, so the police hadn't been too bothered about it until about 1 year later. An arm with a hand attached had shown up in a creek, also close to this part of the mission area. Doreen leaned closer to the screen, studying the article in front of her. Just an arm. That's bizarre. She quickly read through the article, looking for more information, but it was typical journalism that took one salient fact and blew it into complete online articles that really had nothing new to add. And most of these articles were scanned in, rehashed years later. Only the single arm and hand were ever found. They'd been x-rayed after the ring was identified as having been given to her by her best friend. As it happened, Betty Miles's middle finger on that hand had been broken and healed crooked. Does that count as a body? Doreen mused aloud. With no further evidence, the case ran cold. At the time, there was a lot of sensationalism surrounding a series of murders in California, where the victims had all been dismembered as well. Various parts had been tossed into garbage bags and then thrown all up and down the highways. Doreen sat back and considered that. Why grab a victim here in Canada, only to spread the remains in California? Plus, the local police didn't find Betty's arm in a garbage bag, but tossed or buried in a nearby creek. So somebody cut up Betty and threw her body parts wherever he thought they wouldn't be found. And obviously one of his choices hadn't been well chosen. As the tea kettle whistled, she realized she had automatically assumed the killer was male. She almost tripped over Muggs, who stared at her balefully. She glanced at him and said, "Sorry, Muggs. I know it's not your fault you're male. But really, most murders are committed by men." She continued to talk to the dog as she dropped a tea bag into her cup and filled it with hot water. If Doreen hadn't busted the teapot earlier this week, she would be making a complete pot of tea. She had to chuckle. Right now she was working her way through breaking Nan's chipped mugs. Why Nan had decided to keep a cupboard full of the darn things, Doreen didn't know. But having broken 3 already, she would have to find her own source of chipped mugs in a few weeks. Or maybe she could afford to buy a new one without a chip for a change. With a fresh cup of tea, now with milk in it, she sat down at the table to continue her reading. Fascinating stuff. And some of it she needed to keep track of. She got up, found a notepad and a pen, and sat back down at the table. She titled the notepad with the teenager's name and then wrote down found arm and hand, detached after death. X-rays confirmed identity. And then Doreen added the fancy box found in the creek, just for her own notes. She winced. Mac would have a heyday when he found out she had removed the ivory box from the creek, and she hadn't taken any photographs of where it lay in the creek itself. She sighed. I really suck at this job. At the word job, she winced again. She glanced at Muggs, still staring at her. Hey, I've got enough money to buy your dog food with Nan's pocket change, so it's all good. I'll find work at some point. Don't you worry. Muggs gave her a soulful look, interested in something a little more than her words, to reassure him. She got up, walked to the cupboard missing its door, and peered in his food bowl. It was empty. With Muggs at her heels, his tail wagging, snuffling the ground around his bowl, she filled it up again. She spent a moment cuddling the big guy. Muggs was good for a lot of things, and giving comfort was one of them. She didn't know what she'd do without him. He'd been her mainstay, her calm center when her world had flipped so badly through her separation and now the pending divorce. As she straightened up, her back screamed at her from the heavy garden work she had done earlier. She winced, grabbing the counter, finding Goliath there staring down at her. She shook her head. Oh no you don't. You got food already today. Meow. No. Muggs's bowl was empty. You ate his food, didn't you? She turned and walked toward the table only to have Goliath run along the countertop, jump down, and wrap himself around her legs, almost tripping her. She groaned, reached down, scooped him up, and cried out, You're heavy. You've gained weight since I've gotten here. His big guttural engine kicked in, and he rubbed his head against her chin. She chuckled. I'm not that much of a sucker. But he rubbed his head against her chin again and again. Then she heard his tummy growl. Horrified, she walked over to his bowls to find his dry food was gone too. She shook her head. What is wrong with me? Normally, I would never have forgotten to feed you guys. She frowned and looked from one bowl to the next. Did you two just eat out of each other's bowls or something? It didn't matter because, according to Goliath, he was going to starve if she didn't feed him right now. She put him down, scooped up some dry kibble, and poured it into his bowl. Immediately, he dropped his head in and feasted. She stepped back. Doreen, you've got to be losing it. You've never missed a day feeding these animals yet. More than a little troubled, she returned to her seat at the table. Thaddeus wandered from one bowl to the other bowl. But he couldn't get his head into either. Both the dog and the cat were busy plowing through the food she'd given them. She watched Thaddeus for a moment. Thaddeus, did I feed you? Immediately his head turned, and he stared at her with a beady gaze. Thaddeus. Thaddeus. I know you're Thaddeus. That doesn't tell me if you're hungry or not. Thaddeus, hungry. Thaddeus, hungry. Thaddeus, hungry. She groaned. Of course you are. More to the point, you're only saying that you are so you don't lose out. I highly doubt any of you are starving. She got up and walked over to the big hall closet where she kept the bird food. Thaddeus watched her, striding along behind her, his tail dragging on the floor. She didn't understand why he did that. She would look it up later, but it seemed that she never got on top of all of her questions to research when it came to the animals. She always got sidetracked by something else. It was a little disconcerting. She pulled out a handful of birdseed and returned to the kitchen table. She plunked down his food on top, watching as he dug in. There. All animals fed. Do any of you care about me? I don't think I've eaten in hours. On cue, her stomach growled. Life never used to be this difficult. She was torn between getting food for herself and doing more research. Finally, she gave up, walked the few steps to the fridge, and opened it. But if she didn't want sandwiches, it would be eggs for her. And that wasn't something she cooked very well yet. That was why the eggs were still there, like a taunting specter in front of her. She slammed the fridge door shut again. So it would be cheese and crackers again, which she gathered together on a plate. She found some cucumber and cut that up on the side. She stared at the simple meal and sighed. Remember when we had steak and lobster with red wine? None of the animals gave a darn about answering her. Such was her life now too. Resuming her research again, her phone rang. She glanced down at the small screen. It was Mac. He seemed to have a sixth sense when she was looking into stuff she shouldn't be. Shaking off the misplaced guilt, she answered his call with an overly cheerful voice. Hey Mac. What's up? What are you up to? She could hear the worry in his voice. Silence. Nothing, she hurriedly reassured him. How could he know? Now I know you're up to something, he declared. I'll be there in 5 minutes.